If we had a house for every report, review, investigation and new policy and recommendation, then we probably wouldn't have a housing crisis. So why does Rob Callister want to set up another committee investigation on housing? He joins me now to explain his concern. Primarily in this interview we're looking at housing because there's 3 items on the Tynwald order paper this week looking at housing, one of which is a motion from yourself, and that is to establish a select committee. You'd wonder why we would need yet another committee looking into housing when so little appears to be actually getting delivered on housing.
This isn't about housing generally. This is about a specific point, and this is about the financial thresholds. One, to access social housing, but also when you are in social housing and you've gone through a fixed term tenancy, when that tenancy is being reviewed, that the financial thresholds relating to those 2 parts are actually set correctly. Because at the moment, I genuinely believe that the department has set those financial thresholds artificially too low because their focus is too much on the deficiency payment which the department makes to local authorities.
And yet, I mean, another of the motions is from the Poverty Committee, and you are still a member of the Poverty Committee. So surely to goodness, that would have been the place for you to discuss and to explore this issue.
Well, if you take my role on the Poverty Committee, I am still a member of that committee, but I haven't been an active member on that committee for the last year, mainly because I've been dealing with other investigations, and plus the membership of that committee, I needed to step back. Now, one of the recommendations within the Poverty Committee is the fact that they say the financial thresholds for public sector housing is at the right level. I personally do not agree with that, and although I haven't had any involvement in that recommendation from the committee, from my research, the financial thresholds for a young couple trying to access social housing, and the threshold is £38,000, is set too low. It should be set at least the minimum wage, and the minimum wage on the Isle of Man at the moment is around £21,000. So if we were a couple both earning the minimum wage, then that should be around 42 to 43,000. That figure will increase slightly next month when the minimum wage on the Isle of Man increases. So that is part of it. We have a situation on the Isle of Man where a young couple with no dependents cannot access social housing if they are earning the minimum wage. That needs to be investigated. If we then take a situation where people's circumstances improve, and today they are on the minimum wage and they're just about to go through a review, if they are being reviewed today and they're both on the minimum wage, they can expect to see their rent increase by a further 20%. Now, if that same couple is being reviewed next month when the minimum wage increases, they can expect to see their rent increase by a further 30%. Now, just for clarity, this is an additional amount on top of the inflationary increases that the department introduces every April. Now, over the last 10 years, those inflationary increases has seen public sector housing rents on the Isle of Man increase by around £10 million over the last 10 years. What I'm actually...
And 10 million is an easy figure to throw out, but that as a percentage, what does that represent?
It works out about 32.4%. Social housing rents on the Isle of Man has increased over the last 10 years. My main point, what I'm trying to set up this committee, the reason why I'm setting up this committee is the fact that I feel some of the most vulnerable people who are in social housing are now being penalised unfairly, and I think this really does need to be investigated by a Tynwald Select Committee. Now, it's not unusual for a Tynwald Select Committee to look at how a policy is working. Now, this policy originally came from the David Tolson review back in 2013. And then what happened was the Department of Health and Social Care, the minister at the time, which I think was Chris Robershaw, introduced a fixed term tenancy of 2 years. Then in 2014, that was increased to a 5-year tenancy. Those tenancy reviews started to come through in 2018-19. So they've been in place for a good 5 or 6 years. And it's absolutely right that Tynwald has a look to see if that policy is working. because I know from speaking to constituents over the last 3-4 years, there's been many examples of people's rent increasing by 50-60%. Now, some of those people are just about to retire and they can't afford those increases, or some people have retired and taking a small lump sum and have found their rent increase by 50%. This is why I feel a full investigation is needed.
So there's a couple of things in what you've said, well, several things that we need to unpick here. The first one is you are a member of a committee, but you haven't played an active role in it. Should you not just step down from the committee then?
Well, I think on the poverty committee, I will be going back to the committee once they've concluded this particular investigation. Unfortunately, with me being dismissed as the health minister, I then had to go through 3-4 formal investigations when I've tried to step forward to challenge statements being made by ministers and the chief ministers. And unfortunately, when I have stood forward and challenged some statements or information given, that has led to an investigation. So I've had to step back from the poverty committee because of the membership of that committee.
Because two of your former departmental members sit on the poverty committee.
Absolutely. So I have a good working relationship with them, but I needed to step back to deal with the investigations I was drawn into. However, I am now ready to go back on that poverty committee once they've done it. However, this issue around social housing, especially around the tenancies, the financial thresholds, this has been on my radar for many years, and I have written so many times to the ministers. And I watched very carefully back in January last year when the financial thresholds were increased. But it's only in the last 12 to 18 months that I've noticed those financial thresholds have just not been set at the right level. And they need to be set at the right level because, you know, the government department, the Department of Infrastructure, talks about having a waiting list of around 800 applicants for social housing. But I feel if we actually set the financial thresholds correctly at least the minimum wage level, if not higher, then we'll get a true picture of how many people on the Isle of Man desperately need to access social housing. That would also give the government a proper picture of how many social housing units we need to build in the years to come.
Another thing you said was that the poverty committee has decided that the thresholds are adequate. Now, if they have decided that would indicate that they've possibly already investigated it. So why do we need another committee to effectively investigate something that the poverty committee has just done?
Well, the committee have reached their conclusion. They have got an excellent section in their report on social housing, but this really is narrowing it down to a particular point, and that is the financial thresholds for a young couple. So a young couple with...
So did the poverty committee say that they felt that the thresholds are adequate?
One of their conclusions is, but they've used slightly different calculations. They've used the medium sort of income and everything else. What I'm focusing in is on the minimum wage, that a young couple on the minimum wage on the Isle of Man cannot access social housing at the moment. That cannot be right. However, if you actually look at a single applicant with no children can have an income threshold of 34,500. That is almost 40 or 50% above the minimum wage. It just doesn't make sense, and it needs to be explained, it needs to be investigated. But this is really only came to conclusion in my mind once I've started to receive correspondence from my own constituents basically saying they're on the minimum wage, but they're seeing their rent increase by 20 or 30% upon a tenancy review. And as I've said, that is on top of the annual inflationary increases that we've seen over the past 10 years.
And of course, the other thing that people on minimum wage have to contend with is paying the higher rate of income tax, thanks to thresholds being frozen.
But we also have to acknowledge that a minimum wage is not a living wage, which gives you the minimum standard of living, which includes an element of housing.
Okay, what we I think know is that the demand for public sector housing is substantially higher than the supply of houses available. do we not have to be a little bit more discriminatory, knowing that there are fewer houses available than the demand requires, and therefore, perhaps anyway, the idea of setting these thresholds in the way that they've been set is that the very poorest people access these houses, and the people who are slightly better off don't.
Okay, so if we actually look, we have 6,200 around housing units, social housing units on the island. The question is, if we actually break this down to an applicant, what we're actually saying is if a joint couple with no children apply for housing, one has to be on the minimum wage. One almost certainly has to be out of work or working part-time. Now that goes against the government's own economic plan of encouraging more people into the workplace. So we're actually going against our own island plan. Now what you have to do is to actually increase the financial thresholds to a level that's absolutely acceptable. And I take your point about the demand for social housing, and I know we've got 800 to 840 people looking for social housing on the island. That's a good base. But I feel it has to be set at least at the minimum wage level, because that is the level that we feel is some of the most vulnerable in our society. They're the ones really struggling, the hardworking people who go out and work every day of the week, but only earning the minimum wage, which is around £21,000. Then you then take the situation that if they're reviewed next month, they will find their rent increased by 30%. And they're the same person who's maybe possibly being reviewed today. So I feel the whole thing just needs to be, we need to step back, we need to investigate and look at it. Now I know the Minister for the Department of Infrastructure is now planning to say that they have got a strategy to come forward in July. Now firstly, I have to question why after 2-3 years of communicating with the department, they've suddenly at the 11th hour now say they've got a magic solution. I have no problem a committee being set up this week.
I mean, you can question that, but you know what the answer is, don't you?
Yes.
The pressure is put from backbench members of Tynwald, and lo and behold, answers are delivered. Certainly, the new policy alliance is delivering that.
This shows that it's working. However, what we're actually saying is we could still set up a committee this week. We could take the minister's magic solution. We could review that, but also look historically. Now, one of the things that we do need to factor in here is, as I've said, a tenant, a joint applicant on the minimum wage today would probably see their rent increased by 20%. As someone being reviewed next month, same set of circumstances, can find their rent increase by 30%. Now, if the minister turns around and says, well, okay, I've listened to what you said, we will now lift the financial thresholds to say £45,000 for a joint couple with no children, that gets introduced in August. We then have to figure, well, hang on, what about those who have been reviewed in the last 12 months or the last 18 months? Should they be entitled to some form of rebate? Because if the figure had been set correctly from the outset, they would not have seen their rent increase by 20% or 30%. So that is another part that this investigation should really look at.
Government isn't flush with cash, is it? What you're suggesting, I would imagine, would set alarm bells ringing in the ears of ministers who are wondering how are they going to manage to fund all the services that we all rely on. Do you think sometimes you can push too far?
No, I think on this occasion, I think it does have to be reviewed properly. And if a mistake has been made, then we have to correct that. Now, one of the easiest things we could have done and should have done was when they actually put into the public domain the public sector general needs allocation amendments policy for 2023 or 2019, what they could have done is included an element of inflation within those costs. So when you actually look at the gross, the maximum gross income levels for an applicant, then every April they automatically increase by the level of inflation. Now, we could have avoided this whole situation, because the only reason why a couple today being reviewed will find their rent going up by 20%, and a couple being reviewed next month could potentially find their rent increase by 30%, is because there's no inflationary increase, and the fact it does not take into account any uplift in the minimum wage levels. And that's why we're in this situation now where this needs to be fully reviewed.
You do need to be careful what you wish for, because if you put percentage increases automatically built in on one side of the equation, you then also have to do it, or there's a strong argument for doing it on the other side of the equation. And of course, the department has suggested that rather than reviewing rents for public sector housing on an annual basis, perhaps an inflation increase should be introduced. And then maybe every 3 years a review would take place to see whether this was working. Now, had that been the case, the increases in public sector rents would have been much more significant than they have been.
No, they wouldn't actually, Phil, to be fair, because what actually happens is the department normally engages with the local authority, asks for their input, and then what actually happens is they normally use the inflationary figure from September the previous year as the trigger to introduce rent increases from April the following year. Now, if you actually go back, and I have gone back for the last 10 years, as I've said, it's around 32.4%, I think, rents have increased over the last 10 years. When you actually match them up with the actual rate of inflation, there isn't that much difference. And you have to also remember that the department significantly increased the rents from April this year above that inflationary figure. What I'm trying to sort out here is that some of the most vulnerable in our society are not being over penalised with rental charges. Now, again, another factor on this is the fact that the department, I'm really grateful to the department giving me all this information, because it also shows that there's around £760,000 of debt associated with rent arrears. Now, that also could form part of this review, because we do need to understand why there is so much debt attached to social housing. Is it the fact that the department has unwittingly targeted the most vulnerable in our tenancy, in housing sort of units, instead of actually bringing forward a policy that really does shape that inflationary increase every year, so everybody knows it is coming through, but also factors in when circumstances change, such as retirement, such as redundancies, etc.?
It does seem to me that if you are unsuccessful in getting this committee established, as a member of the Poverty Committee that has been investigating housing matters, you could just investigate this anyway. You don't need Tynwald's permission to do this. You just need to convince the other members of the Poverty Committee that this is worth doing.
To be fair, the Poverty Committee did ask me to make a presentation to them, and if I'm unsuccessful, I may go down that route. The other option is, and I'd had already contacted them, and that was the Environment and Infrastructure Policy Review Committee. I did actually send them a copy of my initial correspondence, but I didn't get a reply. So that's something I may also explore. But I think if you look at all of the concerns that I'm raising, I'll raise a lot more in my speech in Tynwald, is the fact is they should have a separate investigation. What I'm trying to do here is support the department to set the right level of rent for social housing on the Isle of Man, but also making sure that we're absolutely very clear in those cliff edges that some of the most vulnerable face in our society.
Let's move on then to the Poverty Committee's report. What we know about that report is it has, I think, 32 recommendations. And it feels, certainly to me, looking at that, that you could end up with some bizarre outcomes, because members will look at some elements, and some members will support certain bits and others will support other bits. With there being so many recommendations, it could be easy for the chair, Mr. Speaker. Now, admittedly, Mr. Speaker is one of the most experienced Tynwald members, but he could end up with quite a job on his hands trying to understand all the different amendments and rejections and support and what have you. Is this just a concern which should be dismissed on my part, or do you think there's something in it?
I think the Poverty Committee have done a really good job. I think just some of their conclusions and some of their recommendations seem to be really far out. For example, I will always, I will not support something where somebody coming to the Isle of Man has easier access to social housing. We've just spent all our time talking about social housing. I feel there has to be. We have a limited amount of stock for social housing. We do have to prioritise, housing going to the most vulnerable on the Isle of Man, and that includes, island residents who cannot buy on the open market to have access to social housing. So to sort of loosen that sort of recommendation around accessing social housing on the island, it still has. I'm in favour of actually keeping that strength there.
So they're not actually saying that people moving to the island should have priority. What they're saying is that there should be equal access.
Agreed. What they're actually saying is that there will still be a priority for island residents, but when you arrive in the Isle of Man, you could start to collect points from day one, or a short period thereafter. I think at the moment, we have some very strict restrictions around benefits, around housing. I think those should stay in place. However, there are other things within this report that I think are absolutely right. I think, when they look around, trying to make sure that that people in housing get them, and government does more around making sure people do have that choice, not just social housing but mid-term rents, first time buyers, open markets. People want to have access to housing options. I think one of the biggest concerns for me is around the rental market. How do people access? Because the report clearly shows, and it's on David Ashford's housing report as well, that clearly between the ages of 16 and 25, I think it is, most people rent. But then slowly over time, as people get towards the end of their 20s, they start to think about settling down. They start to have a look at those options. Government needs to have a rental market that's there. They want to make sure the standard is of the highest quality we can, but we also need to support landlords as well. So it's a double sort of option there about looking after tenants but looking after landlords. And then when people get towards their 20s and their late 20s and they want to start to settle down, that they do have housing options, and that includes, as I've said, mid-term rents, which is a lower market rate to let people save. Government provides more financial support. However, personally, I think any financial support has to be in a way where the government can actually get the money back to invest in the next generation of houses being provided to island residents.
And the final question, because we are just about the end of the programme now, do you have any collective guilt, along with your colleagues in the House of Keys, that you were elected and the big issue at election time was a housing crisis? And almost 3 years in terms of parliamentary sittings, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot has changed.
I think if you actually read all of the reports that are available, especially the one from the Housing and Communities Board, that clearly shows that there's around 6,000 more properties now than there was, say, 10 years ago. So I still cannot understand exactly where this housing crisis is, where it actually is being pinpointed. I think we've got less options, both in the open market and in the rental market, but there's so many questions. This is not an easy question to answer. Have I let people down? I don't think so, because it clearly shows that there is more houses there. And when you walk around the island, and I do a lot of walking around the island, it clearly shows that there's houses being built on the island. The question is, are they in the right location? Do they offer the right options? Have we got the financial support to help people access housing? But more importantly, can people in social housing get onto that ladder if they cannot afford the open market?
And what you're not saying, I presume, is that people are just making this up then, that they can't access affordable homes.
No, I think people can't access, especially in the rental market at the moment, cannot access affordable rentable options. And then thereafter, they cannot secure properties with a low enough deposit. These are all the conversations we need to have, but we do need to identify exactly where that housing crisis is and what options we need to put in place to make sure everybody on the island has a housing option and a housing first option in the future.
So what do you think? Should public sector housing be more accessible for people on low incomes? And if so, how do we pay for the new houses required to satisfy demand? Surely it's time for more obvious action rather than endless words, excuses and jam tomorrow. Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Max Radio's website. For now though, I'm Phil Gorn. Goramayo. Thanks for listening.